for those of you who have joined us for the last 4 sessions. One of the topics that we're going to be talking about tonight is going to be perceptions about aquaculture. So based on the 3 classes that we've had so far and your perceptions coming into this course, I just want to know very quickly, because we've got a lot going on, if any of you have maybe changed your opinions about aquaculture because of something you learned, or if there's something that you thought was really interesting that maybe you had previously a different perception about, but learned otherwise from this course. Does anybody have any of those experiences? Does anybody have any interesting tidbits that they've learned from this course about aquaculture? Yes?
Well, I would say that my opinion has improved positively, because mostly what I had heard about aquaculture before was like the farm tilapia, which I guess is like notoriously dirty, is what I had heard before. And so hearing about how many more species are available for farming, and also all the different methods and technologies for making sure that, you know, pollution is one of the factors.
Great, thank you for sharing. Anybody else? Any eye-opening information? All right, well, I'll let you off the hook because we got a lot to go. But I'm going to introduce our first speaker for you, and then we're going to take a break, and Jerry's going to take over for our panel that we have for you tonight on perspectives of aquaculture in the Southern California Bight. So our first speaker came to us from Santa Barbara. Rebecca Gentry is a doctoral candidate at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on the integration of marine aquaculture development into spatial management of the oceans and considering interactions between aquaculture and other uses, as well as ocean ecosystems. Rebecca has a multidisciplinary background in marine ecology, policy, and journalism. Before starting her PhD, she worked at New Zealand's Ministry of Fisheries at the California Ocean Science Trust on projects such as marine spatial planning that span the intersection of policy and science. She received her bachelor's degree from Northwestern University, a postgraduate diploma in marine science from the University of Otago in New Zealand, she can correct me on that, and a master's degree in environmental science from Columbia University. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Kim. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a subject. Oh, sorry. There we go. It's all set. I'm really excited to be here to talk about a subject that I'm really excited about, which is marine aquaculture, addressing human use conflicts and public perception. I know this is the final lecture in your aquaculture series, so you guys probably know a lot about aquaculture now. So I'm going to skip a lot of introductory material and get kind of right into the subject. It's a big subject and there's a lot to cover. But please interrupt me as I go if you have any questions, any thoughts, anything that I'm glossing over that you actually would like more information on. Just raise your hand, holler out. I'd love to make this interactive. And as I said, I don't 100% know what you've learned in the other lecture series, so I'm going to just jump into it. One thing from looking at the other lectures, I think something you've covered quite a bit is about the potential for marine aquaculture development. And the aquaculture development, when done right, when done sustainably in good places and with good methods, has a lot of potential to be a pretty environmentally friendly source of protein. And there's a lot of potential for it to do a lot of good things. But if you look off our coast, there's not a lot of aquaculture out here. One of the big reasons is ideas between conflicts with other uses and public perception. A lot of people are worried about how aquaculture might interact with other things, and as a result, sometimes it has trouble getting off the ground. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of that stuff, as well as a lot of solutions we have in drawing from science to address some of these conflicts and try to minimize them whenever possible. So just to start off with, planning for new uses in the marine environment is often controversial. Ultimately, space is limited in the oceans, and people have really different ideas about what they might want to do in the ocean. Some people want to use it for industrial activities, other people for conservation, fishing. or they maybe don't want anything out there. They just want to look at a pretty ocean without anything out there. And so inherently, there are issues about what we do there, and that people have really, really strong opinions because they have really strong value systems about the ocean. So before we move much further, we really need to understand what people are worried about when it comes to marine aquaculture development and address these concerns, whether it's through education or through thoughtful planning and regulation that minimizes these conflicts. So to start out, how do people perceive the effect of aquaculture on other uses and values in the ocean? Do you guys have ideas about how you see it and how you think most of the country maybe sees aquaculture? Any thoughts? Positive or negative? Do you guys think it's overwhelmingly more positive feeling about marine aquaculture or negative? Maybe kind of half and half yet?
There's a negative view right now on things like farm salmon. I know that there are quite a few people who gravitate towards wild red salmon.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there is people that worry about where their seafood come from often choose wild salmon. I think so too. Yeah, well, I think that there are mixed perceptions about aquaculture is pretty accurate. In the media, there has been a fair amount of negative coverage, and I think a lot of people pick up on some of the negative things. These are some headlines talking about some of the issues with marine aquaculture, and there certainly are issues. There have been issues in lots of parts of the world with disease, with escapees, with environmental problems. And in fact, there was a recent survey that came out from the Fishing Company and the Global Aquaculture Alliance that showed that about 47% of survey respondents have negative perceptions of farm seafood due to product quality, due to food safety concerns, and environmental concerns. One of my colleagues back at Santa Barbara is doing some research on the media and perceptions of aquaculture, looking at how it's been changing over time. Her name's Holly Frolick, and she is finding that actually it's changing gradually. So the amount of negative press is actually going down and the amount of positive press is going up. So I think these impressions might be changing gradually, but that's still kind of to be determined. Is an exciting area of research. So there are these different perceptions, and I think one issue is that aquaculture is a very diverse thing. There's lots of different types of aquaculture that take place in a lot of different areas. And so the idea that there might be one problem in one place, people often think is happening everywhere. And that's not necessarily true. So I'm going to talk really briefly about some work that I helped on several years ago. I contributed to talking to fishermen, specifically up and down the coast of Southern California, to try to understand what their perceptions were about marine aquaculture and how it might influence their businesses. And they were overwhelmingly not particularly excited about the idea of aquaculture. We did some maps, so using sticky notes, mapping their different concerns and trying to understand how they all interrelated to each other, and then kind of mapped them. Okay, how do they all, what affects what, and then what does it go to? So you can't really see these, but things like how industry waste could lead to loose gear, which would then affect your loss of income in the end. So how these things can lead within each other. And their ultimate concern was loss of income, of course. I mean, it's a business. They're worried about not being able to survive anymore. And their concerns had to do with a whole spectrum of things, from price competition, that having aquaculture come in would make it so that it was harder for them to sell their products at a high price, to being excluded from fishing grounds, and also to having aquaculture actually hurt the stocks that they were trying to fish. Interestingly, one of the working groups we did was in Santa Barbara, and they identified that marine spatial planning, which is right at the top here, so we often refer to it as MSP, marine spatial planning, which is really just thoughtful, proactive planning about where you put things in the ocean, has the ability to influence almost all of these drivers, which then influences their ability to coexist with aquaculture. And so going from there, I think something that we can take from thinking about perceptions and how people think about aquaculture is that the location really matters as to how much these perceptions may be true or aren't true, the scale of aquaculture and where it's located. Traditionally, planning is often haphazard for a lot of ocean uses. People kind of put them without thinking about the whole spectrum of things that can be influenced. And marine spatial planning takes a more systematic planning approach. Here there's two pictures of different types of marine aquaculture, one right at the land-sea interface. And traditionally, a lot of aquaculture is close to shore. There's a lot of conflicts close to shore. People use that environment for a lot of different things. It's close to people and what they do. There often are more issues with pollution and disease when you're closer to shore as well. The picture on the right is at an offshore aquaculture facility. An offshore aquaculture is happening more in response to the idea that if you move further from shore, you eliminate some of those issues. There's more water flow, deeper conditions, you might have less environmental impact and also less conflict with other uses. So offshore aquaculture is an approach to minimize some of these issues. But even with offshore aquaculture, there continue to be a lot of concerns about where you put it and how that influences other uses and also the marine environment. So how can we use science to help these issues of thinking about these conflicts between aquaculture and other uses? And there's lots of different things we can do. One is assess potential, look at all of the places where aquaculture could go and try to understand where it would grow the best, where it would do very well, and compare that spatially. And also identify conflicts, and we have good data about what other areas are being used by other industries, and also conflicts with the marine environment. Where would be the most environmentally friendly places for aquaculture? Third, we can evaluate solutions, so try to understand, given all of these different goals, how we can come up with plans that actually maximize across all of these different goals. And finally, assist decisions, so using interactive spatial mapping tools and such like that to really help communities get together and think about aquaculture in a comprehensive way. In this talk, I'm going to be primarily focusing on identifying conflicts and evaluating solutions. Just so you know, there is a lot more that we can do with spatial planning in aquaculture. So before we go any further, I want to discuss really quickly different types of marine aquaculture, which marine aquaculture is often referred to as mariculture, so I may be calling it that sometimes throughout the talk. I don't know if other people have as well in this lecture series. And there's three quite distinct types of mariculture that interact with the environment in really different ways. So not only where you put aquaculture matters, but also what type you're talking about, because they have different requirements and different effects. So first we have fed aquaculture. That's anything where you put like the input of feed from the outside into the environment. A lot of times people are most concerned about fed aquaculture. Fish and shrimp aquaculture has gotten more concerns due to disease and also pollution, but not necessarily. At the bottom is all types of algae aquaculture, mostly kelp. And kelp aquaculture, you don't put feed inputs, obviously. It instead needs the sun and different nutrients from the water to grow really well. So where we put it really depends a lot on the conditions. And kelp aquaculture has also been shown to have oftentimes some positive effects on the marine environment, especially in polluted areas where there's an excess of nutrients. And then at the top is kind of the general category of unfed aquaculture. Those are mussel lines, but that's incorporating all the types of aquaculture that actually take their food from the environment by filter feeding little particulate things from the ocean. And so as we go through these different types of conflicts, it's good to think about, is this true for all of these types of aquaculture, or does it really depend? Or what about if we put them all together? I mean, there's a lot of people talking about the idea of multi-trophic aquaculture, so if we were to put fed aquaculture and algae aquaculture and unfed aquaculture all together, but potentially that could create even a more sustainable system because the idea that the unfed aquaculture could get some of the particulates that are waste from the fed aquaculture actually grow better, as could the algae aquaculture by absorbing some of the excess nutrients and create a little ecosystem there that creates a lot of food.
Rebecca?
Yeah.
So fed aquaculture just means whatever species you're farming, you have to feed it, you have to maintain it.
Exactly.
You don't just set it out there and let it grow on its own.
Exactly, yeah, that's a general category. It's mostly fish and shrimp are generally fed, although not all fish or shrimp need to be fed. But the way it interacts with the environment, whether you put feed from the outside in or not really makes a difference. So in trying to think about the potentially conflicting uses and management goals in the ocean that might conflict with aquaculture, there's a whole ton, but I've just put a few of them up here. The ones here, like liquid natural gas, wave energy, shipping, offshore oil, wind energy, fisheries, these are all other sort of industrial uses that are taking part in the marine environment as well, and may or may not have different interactions spatially with aquaculture. Also, marine protected areas, so spatial designations where a lot of these things can't happen, whether you want to set this aside and not have fishery, shipping, aquaculture in it so that the marine environment can be protected. It's also things like recreation and preserving coastal view sheds. So people wanting to use the ocean for pleasure, to look at it and to enjoy it, which again may conflict with aquaculture depending on how it's done and where it's done. And also the goals that people really care about with healthy ecosystems, clean water, protecting different species, may conflict with aquaculture. And so this is now a map. Not only do all of these things potentially conflict with aquaculture, or interact with aquaculture, let's say, because they're not necessarily conflicts, but they also all interact with each other. And so we didn't link them all, but so like healthy ecosystems, well, they have a big role to play with marine protected areas, and they contribute a lot to fisheries, and they're important for aquaculture. And all of these areas are two ways. So aquaculture might affect healthy ecosystems, but healthy ecosystems also affects aquaculture. And so it's a pretty, when we look at trying to put all of these different things together in the marine environment, it's a pretty complicated picture of how we do this in a way that really maximizes all of these different goals. Or do we have priorities? Is creating healthy ecosystems our number one priority? And so all the other things kind of need to fit into line where they can. So at this point, I'm going to talk a little bit more about just a couple of these. I've chosen to talk about environmental impact, viewshed, and wild fishing, both because they're ones that come up a lot with aquaculture. People are really concerned about these, and they're also potential conflicts that are somewhat nuanced and depend a lot on what type of aquaculture you're thinking about and where you're putting it. So they're ones that I think really systematic marine spatial planning have the potential to potentially minimize and to try to come up with good solutions that are really win-wins. So I'm going to talk really briefly about effects of farms on the environment. So these are some potential negative impacts of mariculture on different things like marine mammal entanglement. It has happened, it's definitely a concern that a lot of people have that marine mammals could become entangled in aquaculture facilities. And also that they may be attracted to mariculture facilities, try to break into the pens, causing escapees and things like that. There's also pollution concerns, whether it's chemical or nutrient pollution. Disease is something that is also an issue. I mean, just with anything, when you have a lot in a tight area, you can have disease concerns that can spread between aquaculture farms, but also spread to wild populations. And benthic impacts. Carrying capacity refers specifically to unfed aquaculture. In this case, I mean, it could really be for anything, but if you put too much unfed aquaculture somewhere, then it's going to take so much out of the water that it might start impacting the whole ecosystem. But some of these, yes, they are concerns, yes, they are issues, but a lot of them also can be minimized by good on-farm regulations to really minimize things like disease and control pollution by only feeding what needs to be fed, by I mean, there's just all sorts of things that can be done, and also through spatial planning, so where you put things. For example, marine mammal entanglement has been shown to be a lot more likely if you place your farm near pinniped colonies. Kind of makes sense. Or if you avoid areas with like migrations of whales, you're going to have less issues. Things like benthic impacts become much less severe as you go into deeper, more well-mixed water. You're not going to have a concentration right below the pen. Generally, if you're deep enough, things won't fall that far. and say issues with pollution often are minimized if there's really good water flow through the area. So these are things that can be thought about, how much you care about them, how much you might want to minimize them based on site location. It's also important to think not just about the negative impacts of aquaculture, but some of the positive ones. And I referred to that a little bit when we were talking about the different types. But there actually are some things that aquaculture can do, marine aquaculture can do, to really help the environment. For example, filtration. In some closed bays, oyster aquaculture has been shown to actually really improve the ecosystem by taking a lot of the particulates out, and can be a real positive. Nutrient absorption as well can be a positive with kelp aquaculture. And even increased productivity. Fed aquaculture has been shown in some places to increase the productivity of systems that different fish congregate there. They eat some of the waste, some of the excess feed, and it can actually work its way through the ecosystem. So in places that are kind of limited in that sense, you can increase productivity, create habitat, are all things that can be potential positives from aquaculture. So it's really important to think not just about what could this do to harm our system, but also how could we maybe use it, especially if you think of what type and where you might want to do it in a really positive way. Sorry, just to go back to this slide. On effects of farms on the environment, that was a very, very quick overview. It's not really the focus of the talk, but just so you know, this is a really big area, and there can be an entire lecture that's on this slide. So if anyone wants to talk about it more after the class, I don't know how much you've talked about these things in the other lectures, but just so you know, it's a very big subject area that I definitely glossed over. But just so you know that it's something to think about, and that it does vary a lot. And that's, I think, a theme that I'm going to keep coming back to, is the idea that it varies. It varies on location, it varies on species. So aquaculture is not aquaculture. You really need to know what is the farm, what is the scale, where is it located, to really assess a lot of these issues. Next, I'm going to talk about viewshed, which is an issue that comes up a lot in planning for aquaculture. People are really worried about it, that if you put aquaculture off their coast, it's going to impact what they see. A lot of people want to see an ocean that doesn't have a lot of stuff out there. Maybe fishing boats are nice, maybe not, maybe sailboats pretty, but like we want to see an industrial looking aquaculture pen out there. And a lot of people would say no, so it's gotten a lot of opposition of kind of the not in my backyard, we don't want that industrial sort of look in our area. And so what does aquaculture look like? I'm sure over this lecture series you've seen a lot of slides of what aquaculture looks like. And it really depends again. If they're surface cages, I mean, they might look something like this. You can see sort of the surface cage area. If they're near shore, smaller cages, maybe something that looks like that. But it also might look something like this. This is actually a picture that I took off the coast of Santa Barbara. That is a small mussel farm. And you can see the buoys. Kind of right here and right here, you can see the farm. But it's not very intrusive. So although I think people are really concerned about it, comes up and say, well, have you ever seen the farm off the coast of Santa Barbara? And everyone says, no, I didn't even know there was one there, because they can't really see it. Again, this is an issue of how far from the coast you are. So if you go further from the coast, you're a lot less likely to see some of these farms. If there's more waves, there's more chop, it makes a really big difference. NOAA is actually developing right now a visualization software, which is pretty exciting, called CanViz, for marine aquaculture simulation and planning. So that in any spot you can look, they've made it so that you can see what it would look like to have a farm from any spot. And I think from what I've heard from their talks that they've given, a lot of times it's a lot less than people think. They think it's going to look like this really big industrial thing. And often it really doesn't. I mean, even the cages that are above the surface, if you get far enough away, you can't see them very much. So as you can remember earlier, I was saying that fishermen are really concerned about aquaculture. It's a big thing that comes up a lot. They tend to be some of the more vocal opposition to aquaculture, and it makes a lot of sense. Aquaculture is really connected to fisheries in a lot of ways. And so I'm going to talk really quickly about a few different of the interactions between aquaculture and fisheries. Again, this is a really big subject. Aquaculture and fisheries interact across a whole lot of different levels, and I'm going to go through kind of 3 general categories of ways that they interact. And kind of think about how important are, how true are these interactions? Are they more perceived interactions? Or are they real interactions? And what can we do to minimize them if that's what we want to do? So I'm first going to talk about the idea that fisheries and aquaculture interact in markets. It makes sense. They both sell somewhat similar products. They both are selling fish and shellfish. And so there's a big concern of price competition, that if aquaculture comes in and can produce fish more cheaply, it's going to make it so fishermen can't sell their fish for as much as they used to be able to. And it is a real concern. There has been some research that's showing that there's been an effect of this, specifically farmed fish and farmed salmon in Chile. Some people have shown it's had an effect on some of the prices of salmon in Alaska. Also with shrimp markets, there's been some research that's shown an interaction there. Interestingly, usually this price competition is not a local phenomenon. So most of the time, it's not an issue where a local aquaculture facility hurts local fishermen. It's more of a global issue. And for the most part, a lot of the research is pretty inconclusive about this and doesn't actually find much of an effect of price competition. It often creates new types of markets and that they really can't see any sort of direct interaction between the price competition. So while it is a very real concern, it's often not a local concern, and it may be overblown as to how big of a concern it is in the perception of how people think about it. But there also are some positives of how aquaculture can affect markets for fisheries. Specifically, because fed aquaculture relies at least to some extent on marine fish products. That's a whole other subject that I think you guys have probably talked a lot about, which is feed and how it's like actually depending less and less on marine-based products as we go forward. But there can be increased demand for waste, fish waste that can have a value, potentially bycatch, and forage fisheries, so small fisheries can have more value because of aquaculture. There are also some potential to take the markets together. So if you try to do both aquaculture and fisheries, have like a more continuous supply, and some communities have tried to do that to like really kind of link their fisheries and aquaculture in ways that benefit it. Another interaction that's really important with fisheries is with space, so spatial exclusion. For the most part, where aquaculture is, fishermen can't go, and that's a big issue. A lot of fishermen are getting excluded from more and more of the ocean. As marine protected areas have come in, as other industrial uses, and aquaculture is just one more thing that's coming in where they can't go, which is definitely a problem. As you're going to see later in the talk, by using marine spatial planning and looking at where fishermen actually use the ocean, we can try to design aquaculture in ways that doesn't hurt fishermen as much as it might otherwise. But as a positive, aquaculture actually can have some spatial positives for fisheries. One is that fish are usually really attracted to aquaculture. It's a fisheries aggregation device. They swim near it. There's been several studies counting these big aggregations of fish. And so again, if fishermen and aquaculture work together, as they do in some places, it can actually make fishing considerably easier, reduce the effort because you can fish right at the aquaculture area where the fish are. And if the fishermen are excluded, again, it kind of creates a pseudo-marine protected area. It's a place where fish can be, often with habitat, often with a little extra food, that are protected from fisheries. And there have been some studies that have shown that well-placed marine protected areas can actually increase overall fisheries catches. And so, again, if designed well, this could be part of a system, kind of marine protected areas. Finally, fisheries and aquaculture interact sort of at the ecosystem level. The negative, there can be issues of pollution, habitat destruction, disease, invasive species can all be really damaging to fisheries. And again, a lot of fishermen are really concerned about that. Again, some of this can be minimized by farm practices. It really depends what is happening there. But it is a concern. On the positive, I think like I was saying before, there has been some evidence that it actually boosts productivity. There was one study in Europe that showed that fisheries catches actually improved around areas with aquaculture because of increases in the productivity of the system. It can create extra habitat, create extra productivity there. So there are some potential positives. So, given that there's all of these different uses in the ocean, lots of different conflicts and perceptions, what do we do to try to figure out where we should put aquaculture, if we should put aquaculture, and how much it would actually impact these other uses. And so something that we've been using is called trade-off analysis to inform marine spatial planning. And trade-off analysis is a technique that's borrowed from economics. It's used a lot there, and it's the idea of actually quantitatively looking at these different uses and trying to understand how they trade off and how you develop them, how that affects this trade-off, if you can minimize it. It's applicable to multiple ocean uses, and it makes these trade-offs really transparent so that when you make a decision, for some of these there really are conflicts, but you can make a decision informed about how much there is a conflict and how much it impacts in the different uses. And so it's also really useful to managers and to various stakeholders. So I'm going to explain it to you very quickly through kind of a schematic to cartoon to kind of show you how it works. So the idea is like if you take two different ocean uses. In the example, I'm going to talk about aquaculture is one ocean use, so trying to maximize. This way is maximizing aquaculture development, aquaculture production. And then another ocean use, we're going to put on this axis. In this case, we're looking at impact on the viewshed. So, and these do not need to be the same scale, and it can really be any ocean use. So it's a way of kind of thinking about different uses. And in fact, to show it, we're looking at a two-dimensional trade-off between the uses, but you can, and as I'll show you can have multiple dimensions. You can have a three-dimensional trade-off, so actually think about viewshed and aquaculture and fisheries and how they all interact, and on and on and on. So to think about this, if we have aquaculture development here, viewshed impact here, every dot in this space would be one spatial plan. And so this dot would be a certain amount of aquaculture development in a certain place, and how that would impact viewshed, how it would impact your viewshed. So this dot would now be a second spatial plan of aquaculture. So this one has slightly less aquaculture development. Sorry, that's actually should be like so this is positive for viewshed as a soil, that says impact is actually towards the positive. So this would be better for viewshed, but would have less aquaculture. And so you think that there's a trade-off. How much do we want to hurt the viewshed versus how much do we want to have aquaculture? We have to kind of weigh those two plans. But oftentimes, there actually might be a third plan. So this one would have quite a bit of aquaculture development, but it doesn't really hurt viewshed very much. It actually hurts it less than this one. And we can think of an example, maybe moving it offshore a little bit further so you can't actually see it, but you can have more of it. So between those two, there might be kind of a win-win situation. And so it's really important when we're thinking about planning to try to identify these places that are the win-wins. And so a more formal trade-off analysis is we want to look actually at all of the plans, not just one, not just two, not just three, but all of them. What are all of the ways that we could develop aquaculture in an area? How does it affect viewshed or whatever else you're concerned about? And so this is what economists call an efficiency frontier right here. And it's a theoretical best case sort of scenario. Everything along here is a best case. So if you want to maximize aquaculture development, that's all you care about, you're going to choose right here. And anywhere on here is in some ways a really good decision. It just depends on your values. And this is where the real trade-off is. The trade-off, like if you're ever in an interior solution, you should always move to the exterior because there's always a better choice. So this would be like really caring more about viewshed, this is caring more about aquaculture, and there's that whole spectrum. And looking at the shape of this frontier is really important and interesting. So you see things like right here. We can just hurt viewshed just a little bit and have a lot more aquaculture. Whereas like right here, that's actually really hurting aquaculture, or hurting viewshed to get a little bit more aquaculture. So where that curve is really important to think about. And makes you understand that when you're making what these decisions are, and where you choose along the efficiency frontier really is a value judgment. It depends on what the people care about and what you want to do. And so those arrows show that if you just went out there and chose a plan, you might choose this one. But the gains from using a marine spatial planning process and really explicitly thinking about what are the conflicts, what do we care about, is that sort of space and area. So you're coming up with these best case solutions. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go into a case study that talks about a lot of what I've been talking about. And this is research that I'm involved in and been working on for the past several years, looking specifically at planning for offshore aquaculture in the Southern California Bight, which is an issue that's coming up right now. I know you heard from Don Kent a couple weeks back about his plans for Rose Canyon to develop aquaculture off the coast, and there's several other groups that are thinking about developing aquaculture. So what the research group I'm working with is trying to think about how can we take this marine spatial planning process to really think about what are the conflicts, where are they, are these conflicts strong conflicts, or are there ways that we can really minimize them by planning in the right way? So the objectives of the study were to develop a dynamic spatial bioeconomic model for aquaculture in the Southern California Bight. So that's a lot of big sciencey words, but basically just trying to understand how aquaculture acts differently in different areas of the study area, and demonstrate how we can use marine spatial planning to really maximize benefits across multiple uses. For this, we have, again, the three kind of aquaculture scenarios I was talking about before. So looking at finfish, we specifically are looking at striped bass as kind of our example species, bivalve longlines, and seaweed longlines. So those are the three kind of model farms we looked at throughout the Southern California Bight. So we're looking at trade-offs not just among aquaculture and other uses, but also what types of aquaculture do best in what sort of places. And then we did a trade-off analysis. And we looked at the trade-off between the wild fishery, and we looked particularly at the halibut fishery. So we built a model looking at the halibut fishery spatially and then value in different places and how it would affect that. Benthic effects, specifically of finfish farming. Three types of aquaculture, the viewshed impacts from any particular location, how visible it was. And also the disease risk. Disease we haven't talked about very much. I haven't talked about very much so far. It's an issue that has a lot more to do with on-farm management practices and can be minimized, but there is also a spatial component to it. It's been shown that the closer you put different aquaculture farms together, the more likely disease is to spread between them. And so we looked at minimizing the distances between these farms to minimize spread and how that affected the spatial plan. So the first step is to take the Southern California Bight and look at all of the places where we can't put aquaculture, that at this point are just not acceptable. So things like shipping lanes right there. You can't put aquaculture in the middle of a shipping lane, so let's just take it off the table. We can't put it in marine protected areas. There's also military use zones and other places like that where aquaculture is not compatible with the existing uses, and those uses aren't going to change right now. We also took out all areas that were hard bottom. In general, aquaculture, hard bottom areas are more sensitive to the potential impacts of aquaculture. Those sort of benthic effects of things fall down, so those were completely taken off the table as well. As a result, we came up with a series of 1 kilometer squares. We have over 1,000 cells in the Southern California Bight that we said were potentially developable for aquaculture given our criteria. We also had a depth criteria between 20 and 80 meters depth, so that was the area that we were looking at siting. And we then, for each of the 3 types of aquaculture, we developed a production model. So we took, Southern California is a great place to do this sort of research because there's so much data out there about the ocean, about ocean temperatures and ocean currents and things like that. So we're able to do pretty good production models and try to understand where these species would do the best. And so as you can see, this is the map of striped bass production. And as you can see, it does better in the south here. So blue is good, red is not so good. And the growing conditions are really much better down there according to our model. So those are the places the aquaculture industry would value the most highly for their production. We also did a cost model looking at where it would be the most expensive, the cheapest to farm for each of these. They're all slightly different depending on how often you have to go out to the farm, how much it costs. If it's further from shore, obviously the costs are going to be higher because you have to go out there more often. So these are all part of the trade-off and considerations of where you really might want to put aquaculture. Again, the blue is good. The higher costs usually are further from port. We also have higher storm activity, higher waves we put as a cost because you might have higher maintenance costs. Deeper waters are also slightly more expensive. And then finally we did like a net present value of fish farming for each location. So this is really what the industry, what are the most valuable sites for the industry to farm. And again, really the biology was more important. Where the fish grew the best tended to be the places also where they wanted to farm it. So we did this for all 3 different types of aquaculture that I was talking about. And right here I've just put what are the 50 most valuable sites in our study area for each type of aquaculture. And again, these are for specific species. These are specific species production models, and different species might be different. For the ones we looked at, fish did better down in the south. And that also kind of makes sense. It tends to be warmer waters, which generally are better for fish production, but obviously depends what fish you're talking about and its thermal tolerances. And mussels and kelp did better up in the north, which also makes sense. Those waters tend to be a little bit more higher productivity, so they're going to do better for those types of species that require those external inputs from the environment. And so we thought this was pretty interesting because if you're looking at just trade-offs between these 3 types, it's pretty clear which type of aquaculture you should put where in the Southern California Bight. And so as I said, we also did these models for each of the trade-offs to figure out where the most impact would be for across all of these same cells. So this is a halibut fishery model. I'm not going to go into details on it, but it just shows the most valuable and least valuable areas for the halibut fishery, and this is considering both commercial and recreational. The fishery. So did the viewshed model here, the outputs from it, and this is looking at how easily each site in the ocean could be seen from everywhere on the coast, taking into consideration people that live there and also visitation to parks, because people want to go to a park and maybe have an unobstructed view. So if you can see it from more areas, it ended up being a negative for that cell. So then we put all of these into a giant trade-off analysis. And this was very computationally intense because we had 7 different dimensions and 1,000 different locations that they could all go. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of different combinations. I'm going to show you some results, but just to remind you what a trade-off analysis is, each one of the dots I show you in the next slides really does correspond to one set of a plan for aquaculture. So like, for example, one dot would be, okay, aquaculture is in these spots right here, and this one, it's in different areas. And so here's some of the trade-off analysis results. These are still being finalized, so it's a little bit preliminary, but they're pretty much what we're finding. And so like, this is an interesting one. These are across all of the different dimensions. But if we look at mussels versus halibut as a trade-off, I think this is pretty encouraging. So you can see things like at least here, which is actually a lot of mussel development, because 100% of development is developing over 1,000 1-kilometer cells in mussels, which is a huge amount. And so we're really talking about this very small range here of how much development we could possibly do in the Southern California Bight. And if we put them in places that are both good for mussels and good for halibut, we can do that. We really have almost an impact on halibut and still quite a bit of production for mussels, so I think that's pretty encouraging. Yep?
The 100% for halibut, is that the current status of the halibut fishery?
That's saying it can get up to its entire value of how it is now, yeah.
Okay. So that's current, then, as opposed to the mussels, which are...
Yes, that's current. The mussels would be its potential, hypothetically. So, yeah, so these are the different trade-offs. And some of them are clearer, and some of them there's not such a clear trade-off between them. So it's really hard to visualize in any sort of a slide, but we did then take the maps and come up with a 7-dimensional trade-off. And so For example, here's like showing only 2 dimensions of finfish value and halibut value. But actually, each of these dots actually has a value on all 7 dimensions. So this one has like really high value for viewshed, pretty high value for kelp, but has more of an impact on halibut. And so just to realize that each of the dots actually corresponds to 7 dimensions. And I know that's a little bit hard to visualize, but just so you know that that is happening there. Finally, this I think is a map that helps kind of visualize what maybe the value of marine spatial planning for aquaculture and thinking about these conflicts could be. If you were to just place aquaculture based on where it has the highest net present value for the aquaculture industry, so putting it just where it would have the highest value, versus how often that site is selected, thinking about all of these other values that we also want to consider is what this is showing. So if using marine spatial planning, a site was chosen less than would be expected, it's shown in blue. And if it's shown more than would be expected, it's in yellow. So as a result, you can see that using this sort of analytical process would make us choose aquaculture sites that are maybe a little further off from shore, maybe a little bit further north where there's less people, out to the islands where there's less conflict. So it kind of moves aquaculture into places where it can still have a high value, but is taking all of these things into consideration. So what I just showed you was kind of like an end solution of a marine spatial planning process. It doesn't incorporate everything, but it does take some of these conflicts into consideration. As a whole, this sort of process really takes these perceptions, it takes the conflicts, and puts it into a way that we can make decisions in a really purposeful, systematic way, and maybe achieve sustainable aquaculture production while still considering a lot of these other issues. And so that's kind of everything I have here. I'd love to take questions if you have any questions. It was a bit of a whirlwind trying to cover a lot of different topics, so if there's anything you'd like to talk more about, let me know. Oh, and sorry, just before I go further, I do want to acknowledge my collaborators and other contributors to this. I've worked on a lot of this with a lot of different people. Just put that out there.
So each one of those plans was developed by one person or a group of people? Like each one of those green dots on your two-dimensional
Here?
No, right back. But each green dot stands for one plant, right?
One plant, yeah.
How long does it take to develop a plan? How many people?
Okay, so that's more of a cartoon diagram of the green dots. When we actually did it, these are more like the pink dots and are more like clouds. And we looked at every possible plan. So it's a lot of plans. But I mean, in a general planning scenario, you could use these sort of analytical methods and look at everything, but you can also look at, so for different types of spatial management, it's done in different ways, whether it's a collaborative process to come up with these different plans or something's proposed and then people come in. The marine protected areas in California is an example of how they, it's a scientific advisory committee plus a lot of public input and came up with a lot of different plans to try to do it. But what we're really encouraging here is to use an analytical method and look at all of the plans, because when people come up with plans, you can't consider all of them, whereas when you use a computer, you actually can. And it's not going to say that that's necessarily the best plan, but it gives you the ones that you should be considering. And so that's what we're suggesting. Yeah?
Can you go over just another one of those comparisons as sort of you said some are very clear and easy and you've got like, okay, no problem, we can do this much mussel development and have a very minimal effect on halibut fishery. Can you give us an example of one that doesn't have such a clear outline, or like one where the effects are a little bit less positive on both ends?
Yeah, I mean, so one would be on like benthic impacts. We only looked at benthic impacts for finfish, and we were very concerned, like whether is it an impact or is it an effect. When you go deep enough, a lot of times you may not actually be having a pretty major impact, but you are seeing there's probably something there. And so at the duck range we were looking at and the farms that we were modeling, it it depended where you put it, how strong that effect was, but you were always going to see some sort of an effect. It's hard to get away from that completely. I mean, disease is another one. How we model disease, the further apart you put them, the more positive, but you're still going to have some of those, it's a risk. It's not actually saying that there's going to be disease, but it's a little bit less clear cut where you can, I mean, in this one you really don't have it. Maybe you can develop quite a bit without really having an impact, but that's not always the case. Don?
So I understand how you quantify something for like halibut. There's a impact on habitat. Are you really affecting the ability to harvest that critter? So you can say, well, but how do you quantify something like view?
So the way we quantified something like view was that for each of the potentially developable cells, which is like each square here, we built a GIS model that could tell, based on the how the coast was formed, like how steep it was, how far out to sea you could potentially see from every location on the coast. And so a site was penalized more if it was visible from more locations. And then the locations were valued whether they had people living there or whether there was a park there, then that place had more of a value. And so each site you could tell how visible it was. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
And we also then varied it based on whether it was shellfish or finfish. We were saying that our finfish pens were more visible than our shellfish, but perhaps if they were underwater, I mean, it really depends what type of aquaculture. And I mean, again, that's really the takeaway, is you really need to think about what type of aquaculture you're talking about and where you're putting it.
Was another potential factor that went into that, like whether or not there were current industrial uses of that space that are visible?
Something we wanted to do, but we didn't actually look at. So I mean, I think what Sarah's trying to get at is like up in Santa Barbara, we have a lot of oil rigs visible from shore. And so would you say that if you put aquaculture in an area that is already impacted by industrial things in the view shed, would that mean, it doesn't really matter if we can see aquaculture, if we can also see an oil rig. And we didn't, but I think it's interesting. How the sort of view shed issues work is complicated. I mean, the idea of, well, if you can see 2 aquaculture sites, is that twice as bad as seeing 1? How does this sort of, is it additive? There's not a ton of research that's been done on the view shed issues. What has been done for this and for other industries often show that people are more concerned about it beforehand than after, that it's something that people really worry about, but often ends up not being that big of an issue either because they can't see it as much as they thought they would, or what they can see doesn't really bug them that much. But it definitely is an issue that comes up pretty often with aquaculture. Is there another question over here? Yep.
Given the rigor of all this analysis you can do for putting aquaculture in the ocean and ocean management, is there any research showing the same trade-off analysis for land management for animal, chicken, poultry, beef, raising on land? And if that was subject to the same trade-off analysis and the outcomes of that, it can make an argument for aquaculture.
I think that's a really important point that you're bringing up. I mean, so in this particular case study, that's not something we looked at, but there has been a fair amount of work looking at the idea of, is it better to eat aquaculture, like fisheries, or is it better to eat chicken or beef, or how do these different types of animal protein compare? And I think in general it is a real mistake to, like if you're as a consumer kind of trying to think about different things to say, well, aquaculture may not be perfect, so I'm going to go to the store and buy a hamburger and eat a hamburger instead, because the impacts that we've looked at of beef generally are worse than most aquaculture. So yes, that would be really interesting to do, and there are some people that have looked at some of the comparisons across these different types, for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So no, I don't have that data right here, but and you could do it in a more formal trade-off analysis, that how would using this much from here impact these different things. It gets complicated. It's hard to tell exact cause and effects for things, but yep.
That's really a great program you have. It's really cool. Question is kind of, I have a couple of them that are kind of the same thing. How do you get this information out to the public, one, and to the Coastal Commission and other people who might be decision makers so they pay attention to it?
Well, we talked, didn't believe you. And so this group that I'm working with on this research, I mean, we have talked to the Coastal Commission. We're working with different groups of people that are working on aquaculture in California, trying to make sure that they have use of all of our models, that we can provide anything to anybody. And so we have talked with Department of Fish and Wildlife and Coastal Commission and several different groups that are promoting aquaculture here. So, I mean, we're trying.
Right, no.
That's why, I mean, the big part of the outreach is trying to talk to different types of people and make this sort of science accessible so that people.
Are they paying attention?
Yeah, actually, quite a bit. We're working with several different groups that are interested in using these parts of what we've done to try to plan in really good ways.
Great.
So, yeah. To add a little bit more back to your question of different sources of protein, some of the colleagues that I'm working with are doing some more formal analysis of that, which is pretty interesting. So kind of stay tuned with like how much would there be, like if everyone decided to eat fish instead of eating meat, like what would the actual, like what would that do? How much carbon dioxide could we save by making that sort of switch, or how much land area could we save? What does it, and I think one of the numbers that came up, like if, I mean, the amount of food that we're wanting into the future is going up and up, so the demand for protein is going higher. And I think, this is off the top of my head, but I think if we were to meet that demand with like beef, it would take the amount of land of like at least like all of Brazil or something like that to farm enough beef to do it. But if you did it with unfed aquaculture, it would be like less than the shelf area of New Zealand. Like it's very small amounts of area. It would be a huge amount less carbon dioxide. There is a lot out there that's coming. I'm trying to look at those trade-offs.
With those 7 dimensions you have, I forgot if you mentioned this, but are some of those dimensions weighted heavier than others? Is there discrete influences from each dimension, or is it more continuous influence from each dimension? And would something like economic impacts just kind of throw a wrench in that? If you could say, well, all these dimensions are affected like you and the benthic effects, but the economic gain from productive aquaculture would that override everything else?
Well, okay, so there's a couple questions there. One is how we weight them, and you can weight them however you want. So we did it in several different ways of weighting them like 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100%. So if you, like in this sort of, if you were a planning group and you wanted to actually use these 7 trade-offs, you could say we really care about the halibut fishery. That's a really big issue for us. So we're going to weight it 100%. We're going to weight aquaculture 100% too, but we don't care so much about these other things. We care about them a little bit, so we're going to weight them 25%. So they're still factored into the decision, but these other things are factored more heavily. As far as economic considerations, the way that we've done the trade-off analysis is not explicitly looking at economic trade-offs. So each thing has its own dimension, and it's not directly comparable, like the financial impact on the halibut fishery versus the financial gains from aquaculture. We could do that. So a lot of the times, because not everything is quantifiable as far as economics, like how do you think about a benthic effect in terms of how much that costs? You could quantify it economically if you could get good enough data and be good enough with your models to say it might affect something a long way from there, but we didn't do that. We just kind of put it on its own axis. So even though the halibut fishery is mostly financial, it's also it's a recreational fishery as well, so that's harder to quantify economically, although people do. But that being said, if we did put the ones we could on economic axes, you could do a comparison that shows what would the gain be from aquaculture and what would the impact be on these, and look at that. And yeah, I think generally the gains from aquaculture would be significantly more than any sort of impact.
So over the past 3.5 sessions, we've heard about the health benefits of eating seafood as a source of protein versus beef and chicken and pork, and that we should eat more seafood, not less. On the other hand, we've heard a number of compelling arguments why we need responsible aquaculture to meet the growing demand for seafood, since wild capture fisheries have been flat and overfishing is taking a toll on some stocks, and that and also then on the roles they play in marine ecosystems when their populations fall below certain levels. We've heard about the environmental benefits of sustainable offshore aquaculture versus agriculture in terms of freshwater use, land required. We've heard how aquaculture can help conserve working waterfronts because once they're gone, they're very difficult to get back. But we've also heard about the concerns of aquaculture, what the kinds of growing fish that eat fish. We have diseases, we can have pollution, we can contaminate the bottom. We've heard from some of our speakers that the U.S. should take the lead in showing the way to do aquaculture right, and that California would be a good place to start. We've heard some of the issues also that why it's difficult to do anything in California, anything. And we've heard that, now tonight, this is our last chance to bring the different strands together from the 3.5 sessions that we've had and the really outstanding presentations. And that's what we're going to try to do. I often get asked, how can an aquarium be in favor of aquaculture? You're supposed to be worried about marine life. My answer always is, it is because we are worried about marine life that we are involved and strongly in favor of responsible aquaculture, because wild capture fisheries are 2/3 of them or more are at or above sustainable levels. And so we believe that aquaculture, if done properly, can take the pressure off wild stocks, it can still protect the fishermen, the working waterfront, and the challenge is to get the right balance. So tonight we have one is a wild capture fisherman. He's also a wild fisherman, Pete Halme. He's about as wild as they get. He was an engineer, but he's been called the urchin king. Even though he's had triple bypass surgery, he continues to dive for urchins, and he's a remarkable guy. There was an article in Nature magazine where they pointed out that in fisheries, no-managed fisheries, often you can point to one person who has made the difference, and they singled out Pete Halme as one of those people. Sarah Rathbone is the founder of Community Seafood. It's a boat-to-table program 3.5 years ago that was started. It's now a community of over 70 participating fishermen and 500 families in Southern California. She buys mostly from wild fishermen, but she also buys aquaculture products. And so she's a hybrid of a wild fisherman and a farmer. Don Kent, he's a farmer. We've heard from Don, you've heard his introduction, and you know that he is the interim CEO, acting CEO of Rose Canyon. And on by phone is Tom Grimm. Tom is the CEO of Carlsbad Aqua Farm. They grow mussels, primarily though they grow oysters, and they're looking at growing purple hinge rock scallops, and they're committed to developing sustainable aquaculture. He's not able to be with us here in person tonight. He was attacked by some of his oysters. No, actually he had a hip replacement, and so he's talking to us from his home. So I'm going to ask some questions, but then we're going to save some time for you guys to ask questions of any of our panelists or all of them. So, over the last 3 weeks, we've heard a lot of reasons why the U.S. should have more activity to make U.S. a leader in sustainable aquaculture and why California should take a lead role. And we've also heard some reasons why we shouldn't do it. We like to sit on the beach and not have our view corridors obstructed by anything offshore. But I would like to know from the four of you, your perspective, should California take the lead? Like the rest of the U.S., we import 91% of our seafood. Most of it comes from Asia, half of it is farm grown. We like to think that we're the environmental state. Is that good environmentalism? Tom, I'm going to start with you. What's your take on that? Should we be playing a leadership role?
Well, California plays a leadership role in agriculture on so many different sectors, and this is one where we've lagged far behind even other parts of the United States. If you look at Florida, for example, they view aquaculture and agriculture pretty much through the same lens, whereas here it's more sacrosanct to consider using the oceans as part of our larger economy, at least in terms of seafood production. And I think at a great loss both the local coastal communities as well as the carbon footprint that results from importing, as you say, 90-some% of our seafood from abroad.
So Don, what would you add to that? And then we're going to go right down the line, and then Pete, you're going to get to give us the view from the wild capture fishermen.
Well, I'd add to that some of the things that we're losing by not having a more productive seafood industry is some of the infrastructure that exists now with in our bays and harbors, and having a larger industry dedicated to new sources of seafood coming into the same supply chain would ensure that that infrastructure doesn't disappear over time. So it's going to be very hard to replace piers and docks and processing plants that are near the water. Developing a new source of product to go into that supply chain would ensure that those things don't get lost to Hyatt hotels and football stadiums.
And there is something about going down and seeing fishing boats and coming in and offloading. It's different than having an entirely yuppified coastline.
Right.
So what would you add to what has been said?
Well, in terms of looking at California as a leader moving forward, further development of marine aquaculture, I think it's just important that we acknowledge that that mistakes have been made in the past, and we learn how to address those issues that we've experienced, as can be seen by Becca's research, and consider really all of the factors. So I think that it's a solid idea. I just move towards it cautiously. And definitely there are certain things that we have a far better handle on with shellfish aquaculture, mussels, oysters, that kind of thing, the kelp aquaculture that you've heard about tonight. That has so much potential for growth and mitigating negative impacts. And then the finfish is a really amazing concept. I think I'm excited about it, and it's just about how we educate the public and how we move forward.
Pete, would you rather just have these guys all go away and leave it to a few wild fishermen?
When you say few live fishermen, in 2012, the sales impact generated by commercial and recreational fishermen was $25.7 billion for California.
How much of that was recreational?
A certain amount. I don't have that number. Recreational is part of it, and recreational, about 60% is catch and release. If they go to 100% catch and release, they'd add $1 billion worth. So if we are really hungry in this planet for food, we should stop playing with our food and use it for food. The job impact from commercial and recreational is 158,000 jobs. So put it in perspective, you're not talking about a few old guys that are fishing. You're talking about a huge thing that affects everything. And our Fishery Management Council is the strictest of any council in the United States, which is the strictest of anywhere in the world. So the fisheries are well managed. Quotas have been set on those fisheries. We have well managed fisheries. And more than that, when you talk about sustainability of fisheries anymore, you're not talking about whether there's enough fish left in the ocean for the next generation. You're always talking about the impacts on various other things. And these impacts are never considered terrestrially, otherwise you'd never have soybeans. Soybeans, they've decimated forests just to have soybeans, and nobody ever considers that on land. So as you move forward, I see great overlap in some fisheries that may affect wild fisheries, and I see very little in others. So as you move forward, I'd caution that you move forward with those that have the least overlap.
You're not opposed, you want to move forward cautiously and don't do anything to disadvantage the wild capture fishermen. And because.
Right,
one
and
of
I
the-
saw the other part, that you're looking at where fish are caught out there as some place that you may not want to put aquaculture. Well, that has nothing to do where the population is. That's where they're caught. Maybe that's not the most important areas for the population.
But you know, you said U.S. has well-managed wild capture fisheries, and we do. We do. We set the standard. But most of our fish that we eat in this country doesn't come from locally caught fisheries within the U.S., and they come from other countries, and it's well established that many fisheries are not well managed, and in fact, the fish data are above sustainable levels. So I think, but as you say, there are opportunities, but we should move ahead cautiously. It doesn't do any good if we keep the working waterfront if our wild capture fishermen don't have a living anymore. What are the advantages and disadvantages of Southern California? Why not go to some other state that is more receptive to new ideas? Don, what are the advantages of here?
Well, I'm a native San Diegan, so I take exception to the idea we're not open to new ideas. We're just.
Come on, we're going to take your football team away from
Well,
you.
welcome to them. The Browns, anyway. Well, because we have a huge population center here. We have fisheries infrastructure that's underutilized, could be more utilized in the future. We have, California eats about 500,000 metric tons a year of seafood, but we only harvest about 165,000 metric tons. So we're only bringing in about a third of what we need here. So a lot of it's coming from somewhere else. And remember, we have to feed the rest of the country too. So if people in Iowa want seafood, then it's got to come from somewhere. And, I've made that argument before. It's been said, well, maybe people in Iowa should eat corn and we should eat squid. I mean, we catch a lot of squid here. We don't grow corn, so maybe we'll just be out of luck. But, this is an international trade now. And really it comes down to whether we want to import the seafood or whether we would rather grow it and catch it using our own standards. Over dinner, Sarah was mentioning that there's the cataclysmic story that the world's fisheries are all going to hell in a handbasket. There was an article in 2008 written by Warren et al. That said by 2045 all the world's fisheries would collapse. And that was stepped on pretty heavily by fisheries biologists. But that's the kind of rhetoric that's out there right now. And it's not all doom and gloom. We can manage our fisheries properly, but that's not going to provide us all the seafood we need. So if we're going to be self-sufficient, that means we have to start doing it. And we do that in a lot of crops, but we don't do it with seafood.
Sarah, what would you add to that? Why California? What are the advantages and the disadvantages?
Well, I think why California touches back on what Pete was saying, which is really that California sets the standard for well-managed wild caught fisheries. And that in and of itself lends a certain branding to what we're trying to do here, how we proceed forward when looking at our marine environment in a sustainable and responsible way. So if we were to expand aquaculture within this area, in the state of California, we already have the recognition in the international marketplace of being well managed when it comes to wild. So I think the groundwork is there to push forward as a sustainable aquaculture state. And also, touching on what Don said, it's really, when you think about importation of seafood and diluting our local seafood markets with foreign product, when you have the opportunity to replace that with a U.S. managed, U.S. grown aquaculture species, that's really, it's great. It's a great benefit.
Tom, you're the CEO of Carlsbad Aqua Farms down in Carlsbad, close to San Diego. What are the advantages of having your farm in Southern California? And what are some of the disadvantages?
Well, some of the advantages are, as you say, we're near very large population centers. So we look at it simply from food miles, as it's called, being able to bring our products very efficient and with fresh living animals. In our case, we sell our oysters and mussels live, and so bringing them to market very efficiently in our local proximate communities there is very much an advantage to us. And so all our products are sold well in advance of us bringing them out into the harvest schedule. The other part of it is the culture of food in Southern California is very special. There's been an explosion across the country of farmers markets, from 2,000 to 8,000 markets in the last 15 years. And now seafood markets are becoming a very much popular part of the culinary tradition, and I would say culinary tourism. So there's a lot to be said for the Southern California culture as it's embracing locally produced seafood that we think has both economic benefits to the local community, but also adds to the overall coastal, as people talked about, the working waterfront, and rediscovering that fantastic part of California culture that blends culinary activities and the working waterfront with food production and tourism.
But one of the big disadvantages is the difficulty of getting a permit for a new aquaculture operation. Don, you and Christy Walton were saying that you've spent a year on this already and $1 million. It'll take you another what? Another 6 to 12 months?
Assuming we're not sued, yeah.
Now, Peter Uberoff, in a wonderful report that he wrote, a number of 1992, it came out, called Californian Jobs. He had the statement in that report, and this is a direct quote: in California, it often takes longer to get a permit to do anything than it took the U.S. to win World War II. Now, that's a pretty sad statement. You can have a permitting process that has very high standards, but that is transparent, and you get to either yes or no. In California, we don't get the yes or no often. We drag it out until the investors run out of money or patience and they move south to Mexico. Pete.
I'm like the guy in the debate that nobody ever wants to listen to.
No,
He's not so positive about all this, so let's forget about it. We passed the Coastal Act in the early 1970s.
Yeah.
And there was a good reason to pass it. And one of the main tenets of the Coastal Act is to protect commercial fishing. It's written into it. So when this comes up in front of the Coastal Commission, they're going to view very seriously how does this impact fishing. And so that's, you're going to have to climb that hurdle to prove that whatever you do doesn't hurt fishing, because the Coastal Act protects fishing.
and I think that's a very good requirement. We also have embodied in California statute that aquaculture is a legitimate and important use of California waters, but we have this stupid PEIR that you can't lease any state waters for any finfish aquaculture until the process is completed. And Don, how long have we been at this process?
8 years.
8 years.
Don't forget that they had an aquaculture thing for abalone some years ago, and a disease came out of that and decimated 95% of the commercial or the standing stocks of 4 species of abalone. And that came from, it should have been done inland and not in a closed system, rather than having it come out. The abalone were from South Africa, and it's wasting the disease, put it into our commercial fishery, and also the resource. I mean, it's not the fisheries. And now after 20, 25 years without fishing, it's finally started to come back. So we've seen terrible things.
Yes, we have. Aquaculture deserves much of the bad rap that it's gotten, but there are good operations in this state.
That's what you gotta make sure.
Well,
That's what you gotta make sure.
But, okay, I mean, there are certain things we accept in existing operations that we don't think twice about. Rebecca was talking about avoiding entanglement in marine mammals. What's considered, I'll put this out as a question, what's considered a non-incidental take of marine mammals in a fishing operation? Does anybody know?
0.
1,500 seals or sea lions entangled. Now, that's, you could have gillnet fishermen, you have a net out there, and you entangle a couple of sea lions, that's an incidental take. You're an aquaculture operation, and oh my gosh, that guy died, and it's on your watch. So the point being that There's a lot of things that we accept in the existing way of doing things that we're putting a very careful eye on in aquaculture. And there was a saying a while back that was put out by a guy at the Ocean Conservancy, which is right from the start. And the idea was we can have no mistakes whatsoever. There's no room for a learning curve here. You either do aquaculture absolutely right the first time or you're out of luck. I don't think there's anything done in human endeavor that's ever done right the first time. I mean, you ever seen the movie The Right Stuff? The guy's standing there watching the rockets explode, and they're all thinking, hey, in 2 months, one of us is getting on top of that thing and it's riding into space. We have to do so we can learn, and we learn from our mistakes. And as Sarah was suggesting, we need to move this forward slowly and cautiously, but we need to move it forward. We need to quit talking about it. And as much as I love your diagrams, I think they're great, but until we actually go out and start doing aquaculture, we're not going to validate what's in the diagrams. We're not going to.
In a lot of the things, we're careful that now we grow only native species, right?
Right.
You're going to grow native species in Rose Canyon. Tom, in your Crow's Fat Aqua Farm, what do you grow?
Well, we grow scallops and oysters primarily, and I want to make a comment on their role in the larger health of an ecosystem. Much has been said in this discussion so far about the impact that aquaculture can have on the health of the ecological health of a given area. When you have a large shellfish aquaculture operation where every shellfish individual might filter as much as 50 gallons of seawater a day, times tens of millions, the overall benefit to the estuary area where they're growing is tremendous. And it directly benefits the fishermen because these habitats are nurseries not just for shellfish, but for countless species of fish and other types of marine life and shorebirds and you name it. So I think that the role of bioremediation and habitat restoration is a very big part of the future, at least of shellfish aquaculture. So I wanted to have more of a balanced perspective of what shellfish aquaculture brings to the larger question of ecological health and sustainability.
And there are some estuaries where there are large programs, like Chesapeake Bay that we heard about with their oyster reef program. And I was just at a meeting in Portland, Oregon the last couple of days where they're beginning to see, they claim, some benefits from those oysters.
We've seen oysters in San Diego Bay proliferate everywhere, millions and millions of them. They weren't there 15 years ago, and now every jetty, every pile is covered with oysters. I have no idea where it came from. And other places say, let's grow oysters. Well, but they're not good oysters because they're laying flat and they won't have anything. And besides, would you eat an oyster from inside San Diego Bay? You know? So you have to keep the place clean. It's probably a pretty good indicator. What happened here, and probably that's where we should move from, is I brought up the worst case scenario for aquaculture, and Don replied with the worst case scenario for commercial fishing. I think where we have to get to is people like Don and I coming to where does it work good and where it doesn't. Because just saying aquaculture is good and fishing is bad or fishing is good, it isn't going to work. It's going to have to be.
They have to coexist. They both have important roles to play.
And maybe it's a young guy like me who's adamant about what he thinks. Maybe you got to leave it to our elders to do this.
Or maybe somebody like you who's known as a champion for wild capture fisheries. If you were to come out with statements that we have to coexist, we have different roles to play, we can complement each other. Aquaculture can help increase the production. It can help us maintain the working waterfront. Could you ever find yourself in a position where you might make a statement like that?
I guarantee you I would no longer represent fishermen the next day. I think we will find somebody else to represent them. But I agree with you. Not that my position is all that goddamn important. It's become, I got a nice hotel room for coming up here tonight.
We'll let you come here. All right. So, Sarah, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to touch back on Don's point about cautiously moving forward. I definitely agree that moving forward is necessary, but from your perspective, from the person who's invested all of this time and all of this money in the development of this idea and actually putting it into practice, how is it possible to quote unquote cautiously move forward after so much time and financial investment? I mean, is that what I understand that you're really saying is we just have to put it in place and try it out and we'll learn as we go, which is all well and good, but there is that's where people get really nervous about.
But what's anticipated to happen? We put a farm out there, and then all of a sudden you walk from Long Beach to Catalina on cages. It's not going to happen.
Right.
We're talking about $50 million investments here, and what it creates, and something to understand is he says I'm a commercial farmer. The reality is I'm a biologist. I work for a research organization.
You're an aspiring commercial farmer.
I don't have anything to do with running the farm. I want to solve the problems the farm's going to have. We've developed technologies. We've developed diets and disease treatments and spawning techniques and rearing techniques and technologies that the only people that want to use them are Mexico. And do we want to export the technology and then import the seafood? And if that's a model that works for the commercial fishing industry and for the supply chain, that's fine. I've talked to business people and they go, I say, we're importing 91% of our seafood. And they go, well, that works, right?
Yeah, that works.
So what's your problem? And it's like, well, I'd like the fishermen, if they want to have the alternative of using their boats to also go tend a farm as opposed to just capture fish. I'd like the processing to stay here instead of being in Mexico, so that we're bringing in product that gets processed here instead of bringing in fillets that were processed somewhere else. For every job on the farm, there's 2.5 jobs downstream. And so the cautious aspect of this is, let's put one in. I guarantee you there aren't going to be 15 more within 20 years. And we'll have something to study. We'll have something that people can come out to, and they can look at the bottom, they can look at the water column, they can see the quality of the product, and they can sit on their houses at home and, can I see that or not? It's going to be 4.5 miles out to sea. And we don't learn anything by just studying it and never doing it. It's sort of like we're designing the new airplane, but we never built one. It's going to be really bitchin' when it's done, but it's not going to fly because we never built it. And we're never going to make aquaculture better and more reliable and something that strives to be more sustainable than it can now. If we don't get out there and start doing it ourselves, we're just going to let Mexico and Canada and Taiwan and everybody else continue to do it and then buy whatever they'll give us.
And in that first report that we all worked on, it was very clear that any farm would be held to certain high standards, and if you didn't meet those standards, the operation could be shut down. So,
First of all, what John is doing with his, is that John?
That's Tom.
Tom. What Tom is doing with oysters and mussels and so on, that's very easily compatible with fishing.
You like that guy, huh?
I like that guy. In fact, I wish we have a market in San Diego every Saturday. I wish we'd have some of this product there. But we're working on those details now. Because the idea is we have to change that dynamic of 91% imported. And this may be part of it. But the biggest part of it is Americans have to start eating different fish. And if that doesn't happen, the hamachi that he's growing might fit some small slice of that market. But it may have to compete with 60-cent our yellowtail went to 60 cents a pound from Mexico, or 40 cents a pound.
A more diversified.
Well, you see,
but
Don
also
doesn't want to compete with 40 cents a pound fish.
No, unless we demonstrate that you can do it with a fish that sells for $5 a pound, you're never going to get to a point where it's grown as a commodity. We have to demonstrate how you can do 5,000 tons sustainably before we can go to 100,000 tons of something that everybody can afford to have day in and day out. And that's, in essence here, I mean, compare a wild salmon to a farm salmon price-wise. And that's what we're ultimately looking for, and that's what scares a lot of fishermen. And But at the end of the day, if we're not gonna do it here, then it's gonna get done somewhere else, and the competition is that. It's not here in the country, it's somewhere else. And we've lost out on the ability to have that product and that economic benefit within our seafood industry.
Does any of you have a champion in the state for aquaculture, finfish aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture, and wild capture fisheries? Who's your greatest champion? What's that, Tom? Do you have a champion?
Yeah, well, I would say that there was a national initiative, the National Shellfish Initiative has its counterpart in California, which is the California Shellfish Initiative, and it's led by a couple of different people from NOAA on the federal level. You got Mike Rubino on the state level. You have Randy Lovell, who's with California Fish and Wildlife, who is what they call the Aquaculture Coordinator. And then you've got a trade association, which is the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association. These three groups have a working group together, and our collaborative task is to get agencies to cooperate together, which is a daunting task. There's little fiefdoms almost between these different agencies, and there's so much paperwork that it's absolutely mind-boggling. And so, as much as these organizations are collaborating together and NOAA's helping out and Cal Fish and Wildlife is going forward with this effort, when you look at the actual permitting process, it is absolutely dysfunctional. And to get to, as you say, like what Don is dealing with his challenge, which I think is very laudable, but just getting additional acreage for shellfish, which communities around the United States, Puget Sound, Chesapeake Bay, even New York Harbor, are putting in shellfish areas just for the bioremediation benefits. Here in California, it's much, much more challenging.
So, what, do you have a champion, Don, other than me?
Between the two of us, they're just not pretty enough, Jerry. You know, I haven't talked to an agency or to a state person. Everybody from Chuck Bonham to Secretary of Resources to, you know, everybody thinks, wow, what a great idea. And, well, I mean, they recognize the value of it. And I've sat down with the head of NOAA, and she thinks it's, you know, Catherine Sullivan thinks it's a great idea. But getting from, wow, great idea to, hey, here's a permit, wow, you know, it's just, you're kind of then faced with this big black box that's faceless and really doesn't know the process it needs to undertake. It knows what all the pitfalls are and wants to avoid them, but that reticence keeps them from leading.
If one of the issues in California that fisheries falls under one department and aquaculture falls in agriculture, is that an issue?
Well, actually, aquaculture falls in the same agency as fishing does in California. It's by mandate, it's managed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Okay.
The same as commercial fisheries are. And therein lies the rub too, because sometimes there's so much reticence about the wild resource that they don't want to take on something that, you know, has a different connotation they have no expertise in.
All right, so
And when you consider the Department of Fish and Wildlife today, there's no champions in there anymore for either aquaculture or fisheries. And so we've formed a commission under the Department of Food and Ag, because the Department of Food and Ag goes to bat for the farmers. They do research that benefits them and so on. They support them, whereas our Department of Fish and Wildlife just looks for problems that we're having, because California is green. There's no other state that's as green as California.
Or that we think
environmentalists
we
run
think
the
we're
thing.
green.
And if you do something like Don or I want to suggest, the lawsuit comes immediately. And they start a campaign with deep pockets, and they seem to think that idiot DiCaprio is better looking than I am. You know, and Jesus, obviously they don't want character, they want you. But you see, and these people just say that they become experts. DiCaprio says, wild fishing is going to hell in a handbasket and so on. I say, what the hell does he know? What he knows is he can throw $5 million at it. And I can
What
put
would
30
it
cents.
take to get a champion? Not somebody who's gonna fight against what you guys wanna do, but what would it take to get a champion? Would have some high visibility. Tom, what do you think?
I'd like to offer an opinion. One thing that I'd like to suggest is that there's a question of political will at all levels of government here in California. But one of the ways to change that, I believe, is at a grassroots level. What we're developing in the lagoon in the area that I'm operating is a program where the citizens can come out and help us build oyster reefs, help us plant eelgrass and various types of systems that improve the water quality for everybody, for recreational use, for fishermen, for, in this case, in other industries. And so the public has to be engaged, not just passively informed through special interest groups, but the community at large in California, and I would say more broadly, loves the ocean. And they're just looking for an opportunity to participate. And I think if we could create programs that engage citizens, citizen science programs, young people, and the community at large, I think that'll help persuade political leadership to themselves re-examine aquaculture in a different light than the narrow one of just regulatory processes.
I'd like
It's
to,
area you work with.
yeah,
What
I
would
was
you
going
add
to
to
second
that?
that concept that maybe it's not just a single champion we need, especially with our extremely complex management structure and oversight process. Maybe it's more of this grassroots swell that comes from education, that comes from new information coming to light with new technologies that really pushes this industry to the next level. I know in my business, taking a single individual and educating them about the wild fisheries that I work with and the mariculturists that I work with, it's something they've never heard before. It's all new information. So it can have a huge power, and we're actually working from a top-down perspective now with accessing top chefs in the LA area, because instead of just distributing this message to the individual consumer, to the home chef, where I go through my whole spiel and I get them on board and they're really excited and that's their own personal life change, where they're going to go now make more sustainable decisions about the seafood that they choose to consume, we've decided to approach it now from a more top-down level, where the top chef that everyone trusts in this one restaurant has the ability to broadcast messages such as new, sustainable, responsible aquaculture, wild, local, California caught finfish and shellfish species. These are all positive choices. So I think it's more of a grassroots.
We have some successful shellfish farms where you can take people to see, look at them, give them a tour.
I personally went to the Carlsbad Aqua Farm and got the full tour. It was a very impressive, very zero waste.
And you can involve people. I think the point that Don has made previously is, right now we don't have any fish farm to take people to let them see how it's run and so on. And there's a program in Maine where they take people to the various farms in the Gulf of Maine, and it really changes the perception.
Well, I think, okay.
Go ahead.
I think going back to that earlier comment about this sort of catastrophic language that's thrown out there that all of our fisheries are overfished, things like that can be extrapolated and blown way out of proportion. And really what you have to do is educate yourself about your own region, about different types of industry, different types of species that you're talking about, because as you can see from Rebecca's presentation, as well as what everyone has to say, it really is specific to, and it depends on what you're talking about, and that really determines impact versus benefit, and so it's really about education.
Fishermen get set with a bunch of regulations, and within those guidelines of those regulations, they set fishery tactics. That's how do you maximize the amount of money you make with the least possible impact on the resource. But I think now what's needed is the consumers got to have tactics. How do we, if we want to solve this problem as consumers, what are we gonna do? Well, you can eat Don's stuff, or you can eat my stuff, but
Or both.
you're gonna have to expand, basically, stop eating the stuff that's harvested by slaves somewhere, and somebody says, well, I'm never gonna do that. Do you think the wholesaler's gonna say, buy this $5 swordfish because it was harvested somewhere in Sri Lanka by slaves or some goddamn place? Everybody knows, in the fishing industry, everybody knows up and down the chain of custody, one up and one down. And you don't ever go follow it. And nobody knows how to follow it back 3 or 4 or 5 because the guys themselves don't know. I buy from this and I sell it over there, and that's what I know.
Pete, isn't that an argument why we should do more right here in California if we really want to be green? Grow some of our own so we know the chain of custody.
Well, you're really persuasive.
I think you and I have to give up on Leonardo DiCaprio. Some people,
No, but
people
why
just
don't we pass the hat around and get some good-looking Hollywood gal? Send me up to Hollywood for a couple of weeks. A few $1,000 and I'll try to get some.
Let's throw it open to any of you. You can ask a question of anyone individually, including Tom, or you can ask the panel as a whole. Who has a question? Luke, we'll start with you.
It does, I mean, you guys kind of mentioned this already. It seems like the real problem is that you've got a bunch of agencies that really just don't know who to point. Like, oh, go over there and talk to them, we go to talk to them, and then they take it back to the first guy. And this is the kind of thing that goes away the moment there's a big movement that says it should go away. I mean, it just takes a few acts of Congress or whatever.
It takes what's called leadership.
Yeah, but it seems like there's no real, nobody's like categorically anti-aquaculture. It's more like, assuming everything's cool, then everything's, just perfect and fine, that we're all cool with the idea of tentatively going ahead with it, but the problem is they can't get anybody to do it. So,
No, it's really more,
really it?
we can identify the individuals within each agency. They're all sitting around there talking about it, but it's, each agency knows how to issue the permit they need to issue. And NOAA doesn't issue a permit, but they consult on things like essential fish habitat, marine mammal entanglement, that sort of thing. But really what it comes down to is the NEPA, the public review NEPA process. And that's the process that says you, as private citizens, get to read the Federal Register, see what it is Don's trying to do, and comment upon it. And you probably heard that, like the desal panel, Carlsbad used that example, 12 years lawsuits. They were never suing over the idea that, that salt's going to have a problem when it goes back out in the ocean. They're suing over is, you guys didn't file the paperwork on Tuesday, you filed it on Wednesday. It's a procedural thing. And since nobody's ever done this before, nobody's ever established a protocol under which to do the review. So they're all sitting there trying to be very careful in the process so that it's defensible after the fact, after permits are issued, that the process they used was appropriate under National Environmental Protection Act. So it's not really so much reticence as it is a lack of, we don't really know the path to follow here. Once it's done and it stands up the test of time, then the next person can come along and it'll be a little bit easier. Not that they don't have to jump through the same hoops, but at least they know how the hoops are lined up. Follow?
Yeah.
So again, it's not so much, we don't want aquaculture, or yeah, we want it, and we're just not going to do anything about it. It's really much more of how do we do this and do our jobs as regulators. And it's really about never doing it before. They don't have the experience to draw from.
But don't you think it also is that there's not a clearly identified lead? It's
Are-
like when you have kids, and one of my daughters used to come to me, if I didn't like the idea, I'd say, go talk to your mother.
I would make the argument that NEPA is about environmental review, and the vast majority of the issues that people have concerns about are really within the purview of NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service specifically. But in the case of my program, since I'm not planning on growing any fish that's federally managed, there's no trigger for NOAA to issue a permit, so they don't feel they can lead the NEPA process. I think to solve the problem, they should go back, do what Catherine Sullivan suggested, and amend the Aquaculture Act of 1980 to make NOAA the lead agency for permitting aquaculture. Doesn't shorten anybody else's responsibility. It just clearly says, NOAA, you now have the regulatory authority to review all the considerations people have and take the lead in that process. And it's the most appropriate because the Army Corps of Engineers really isn't worried about marine mammals. They're worried about engineering. The EPA isn't really worried about competition with fishermen. It's worried about pollution effects in the Clean Water Act. NOAA has the responsibility to make sure that this doesn't adversely affect fishing, it doesn't adversely affect marine mammals or anything else. So I think that's probably the role to go in, but I'm not waiting for that to happen. I have to get this done now before I'm dead in the grave for 5 years. If we're going to change a law, that's going to take some time to do. So.
We have a question over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is for Sarah. Am I correct in understanding that the purpose of your organization is to promote the consumption of seafood responsibly by knowing where it's sourced and specifically local species?
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. So in our typical industrial seafood chain, you have anywhere from 5 to 15 to 20 different people who interact with your seafood before it actually gets to the plate on which you consume it. So that in and of itself is a function of refrigeration and transport and the industrialization and global market of seafood. What essentially Community Seafood does and Dock to Dish is that we are shortening that chain and therefore providing that complete traceability. So something that Pete mentioned was, you know, one wholesaler will have information about the fish on one side, 1 degree removed, and on the other side. But if that chain gets too long, you start to lose that security and that knowledge about where your fish is coming.
So, Sarah, I have to ask you this question. You've been down to Carlsbad. Presumably, you've bought some oysters from Tom. You've bought some shellfish from other places. No, he's not listening. Tell me, assuming Don gets his permit, will you buy some yellowtail from him?
Yeah.
You would?
Well, I mean, so for me, what it really is about educating the public. I need to create that market within my own, within the families that I work with and now the restaurant patrons that I work with in order to push their desire forward. Because what we see is that our supermarket shelves, our fish market counters are going to be popularized by, or going to be populated, I should say, by the fish species that are demanded by the public. So if we have sort of this misinformation about aquaculture, people are going to reject that product. It's going to have a hard time pushing forward, and obviously Don is talking about a huge volume of fish and a great demand for that fish. So there will be a market regardless, but what I'm trying to do is more educate our local consumers so that they start demanding it, so that replaces what is currently imported and under-regulated.
And so, Pete, during the part of the year when there's no wild fishery for yellowtail and you're dying for a good fish dinner, and as long as your fellow fishermen don't know, would you eat one of his yellowtail fish?
I prefer bluefin that's coming in. You have choices. So you would choose something probably that's just as good and cheaper. To tell you about what we did in San Diego, and it's spread throughout, I don't know if you've heard of Pacific to Plate. It was legislation that enabled the fishermen to start fishermen's markets. And we're not talking about any middlemen. The fisherman himself sells to the public. And you're not allowed to buy from different people. It has to be your fish or the fish from 2 other people. And we set the legislation where some of my fellow fishermen said, why the hell are you making it easy for everybody else to do it? Because that's how it gets done. We have San Diego, a market we've had for 17 or 18 months. It's working very well, but we could improve it a hell of a lot. But now other people can look at that model and start fish markets, fishermen's markets. And we're the only fishermen's market in California right now. Because the laws between Department of Environmental Health, Fish and Game, and the Port District, they sent us in a circle for about 5 years. And finally somebody wrote an article look, they're making fools of the fishermen. And the next day, the people, the supervisor called me up and said, hey, Pete, I remember talking to you about 4 years ago. You want to get that done today? I said, we're going to have a press conference 2 weeks from now. We want it done. And all of a sudden, it just, because it was like Don's idea, all these, everybody likes it, but it doesn't move because they keep handing it off. And nobody has money. That's the biggest thing. Governments have wasted everything, and they don't have enough money to do anything.
They haven't always find money to do foolish things.
Yes.
All right, we're running late here, and so this is kind of like the Republican presidential debates. Okay, so we're going to give each of you a minute for a closing comment. What do you want people to go away with? And we're going to start with Don and end with Tom.
Nothing done by humans is perfect, but we strive for that. And we learn by our mistakes, and unless we go out and try, we never do, and we never improve. So my take-home message would be, if we really want to have a sustainable aquaculture industry, we need to get it started and learn from it and make it better over time.
Sarah?
I'm excited for a future in which we have both wild-caught and aquaculture species that are grown in America, grown in California, hopefully, that share the marketplace and that are demanded equally by our local residents.
Pete?
I look at it as a commercial fisherman. You know, I can't view it any other way. And the only way forward I see is areas where there's no overlap. Would move forward. The rest of it would start butting heads. And if these two groups butt heads, I don't think it moves because the Coastal Commission will be stuck with the same. So to move forward, it has to be done in the way that there's the least amount of overlap between commercial fishing and aquaculture.
And don't you believe that there's the opportunity to find those areas where there's little overlap?
You keep poking and poking. That's what I said.
Yeah, all right. Just want to reinforce that. And
But I didn't say it in your words.
No. And you and I are going to go up to see, what's his name, together, okay, to Hollywood. All right, Tom, what's your closing thought?
Well, my closing thought, first of all, is to thank you, Jerry. Thank Pete, Don, everyone, for a fantastic workshop. It's been very exciting to be part of it. And this is the kind of process we're going to need if we're going to advance these efforts in a collaborative, productive way, as everybody here is clearly looking towards. I want to say one last thing. The California brand for food is unexceeded in the world. It's a recognized brand for the quality and exceptional commitment to excellence that California has. That also translates to the seafood industry, on whether it's for wild fishing or from aquaculture. It's something we can leverage, could have an enormous impact economically that will benefit the coastal communities of California. So I'm again grateful for the efforts that everybody here is undertaking to support this conversation, and hopefully we can use that to leverage and encourage leaders to have the political will to advance this possibility. So thank you, Jerry, and everybody for this workshop.
You know, it's interesting, someone that was here to give a talk, professor from Stanford, made the point that we need dialogue much more than we need advocacy. There's an awful lot of advocacy for and against, and what we need really is dialogue like we've been having over the last 4 weeks.
This old man says communication systems have gotten very good in the last 10 years. Communications have not.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I want to thank Kim for all of her efforts to put this series together. I want to thank Adina for all the food and the logistics. And I want to thank all 4 of our panelists. I think this was a very good discussion. Pete, I just wish occasionally you'd have an opinion about something.
You would never invite me.
No, we would always invite you back. Thank you all. I think it's been a very good discussion.